I mean,
Sure.
come on, let's talk toothpaste here. No, but you were telling me that in order to understand things going on pre-Civil War with activists and after, and even leading up to through World War One, up through World War Two, and then the Civil Rights Movement, you kind of have to get an understanding for the revolution and how that kind of set the foundation for it.
Yeah.
So talk about that a little bit.
Well, for better or worse, Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence gives us a wonderfully impossible phrase. It's one of the greatest phrases in American, I think in American history, maybe the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And it's that concept of equality that has proven to be a beautiful burden for us.
Beautiful burden.
It is, because first of all, what does that mean, that all men are created equal? Well, so to your question is, I kind of hear your question as like, when did the civil rights movement begin? I'm going to suggest that the civil rights movement begins when Jefferson makes the claim that all men are created equal.
Because you look at that and you say, all men? Are all men created equal?
Well, right. Or if you believe that, I mean, there's several problems with it. First of all, the obvious one, that he's a slave owner. And then the problem is, if he says that, created equal, but I look around and I see people that are smarter than me, I see people that are more wealthy, I see inequities in life.
Regardless of race.
Sure. So what does that mean? And I think a lot of our history, we've tried to sort out the meaning of that. So when it comes to the civil rights movement, I think that phrase in the Declaration is tremendously problematic in the sense that, okay, does it mean, well, there's different intellectual.
What does a man mean is the real question.
Well, I think he did mean it in a generic sense. I don't think he was referring to gender there. It is interesting, though, in about 70 years later, some women got together in Seneca Falls, New York, and it was arguably the Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's convention in our history, 1848. Mm-hmm. They borrowed Jefferson's language from the Declaration of Independence and kind of riffed on it to establish the fact that they, as women, had not been seen as equal in the Declaration.
And the question is also, all men are created equal. Are black men included in that?
Sure.
That's kind of
the
civil.
So immediately, right
question.
Out of the chute, we have this tremendous problem. What does that mean? Does it mean intellectual equality? Probably not, because there are smarter people than other people. It doesn't mean economics. It doesn't. So I mean, does it mean socially that all people are on the same social plane? There's all kinds of problems associated with how you interpret that phrase, that men are created equal. And so I'm going to suggest from right out of the chute, we have a problem in this country of defining what that means. You know, and several years later, we get to the Constitution, where African American slavery is set up and codified and protected in the Constitution. The Fugitive Slave Clause. If you're a runaway, the laws were passed that allowed you to go get your property that had run away. The 3/5 clause, it gives southern states more representation. It counted, every 3 slaves counted as a person. So in their census, which increased their representation in the House of Representatives. So there's a tremendous, our Constitution, it kind of sets up a system that protects slavery. And all along, we're insisting that all men are created equal. So it's a tremendous problem for our country. And so when you have, it's interesting, in the American Revolution, the British, they would say, Americans were using this, the British are treating us like slaves. If we submit to British tyranny, it's no better than being slaves. It's slavery if we submit to British tyranny. So the British, without missing a beat, would say, isn't that interesting that Americans, what is that? One British writer said, what is that I hear in the background but the but the agonies and cries of slaves from people claiming to be treated like slaves. So I
Hmm.
mean, so there's a tremendous irony in the rhetoric of the revolution about being treated as,
So that kind of nonsense existed forever.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just
Absolutely.
exclusive to
Yeah.
to today.
And after the American Revolution, there was an interesting set of letters that went back and forth between George Washington and Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette was one of those foreigners that came over seeking fame and fortune in the American Revolution. He was a Frenchman.
Searching for the American dream.
No, I think, well, in Lafayette's case, I think he was young and he kind of was excluded from kind of the in crowd in France. So he saw the American Revolution as a way to kind of raise his stock and get some cred back home. So he comes as a very young man. I think he was like 19, 20 years old when he came, and immediately introduced himself to Washington and says, "You ought to hire me as a general." And Washington's looking at him like, "Who the heck are you?" Now, eventually he grew to respect Lafayette. In fact, I would suggest there was a deep, deep abiding friendship between them. But after the war, back to getting off topic,
Yeah.
Marquis de Lafayette writes Washington and says, "I have recently purchased, I forget the acreage, in the Caribbean. And wouldn't it be great if we take ex-slaves and set up a system here in the Caribbean and show the world that that slaves are not inferior? Would you like to be involved in this project?" And Washington writes back and says, "Interesting idea. Let's talk about it the next time you come to America and you stop by Mount Vernon. We need to talk about this." Now, there's no so my point being here is, during the revolution, immediately after the revolution, there's some people that fought in that war that understood that this slavery problem is a real hypocrisy. Jefferson feared too. I mean, there's this famous quote that I fear that if God is a just God, He's going to judge this country for us having slaves. And this comes from a slave owner. It's like holding a wolf by the ears.
Yeah.
If you let go of that wolf, you're going to get bit. If you hold on to the wolf, you're going to get bit. So the founders were tremendously conflicted about slavery, and Lafayette posed this experiment, and Washington never acted on it, and we don't really know whether they really actually talked about this idea. So from the get-go, slavery is a problem in the country. And with the first, I mean, Missouri, when it petitioned to become part of the country in 1819, the question was, well, if they come in, does slavery go west? It was all about maintaining a balance in the Senate. So if Missouri comes in, and the eventual bargain was Missouri can come in as slave, and Maine would come in free as free state, and the balance in the Senate would be maintained. So every piece of turf we gained is in the 1800s as we moved west. Slavery was the question: does it go there or not? So there's always the issue of slavery. Now, does the anti-slavery movement pre-Civil War equal civil rights movement? Now, that's a perspective. I think some people would say no. The civil rights movement isn't until later, but I'm going to suggest for your consideration that maybe there is a civil rights movement before the Civil War.
Far before.
Sure.
During the Revolution.
Sure. And this push for equality, whether it means economic or social or whatever category of equality you want to talk about, I'm going to suggest that those are issues that are rumbling around in America. Within the slave community, within the free black community, within the white community, there's a tremendous discussion about what is the status of slaves and freedmen.
And the essential question here is all men are created equal. In my mind, I think to myself, okay, so that means, hang on. Okay. In my mind, I think to myself, okay, all men are created equal. Does that mean all men and women, obviously, deserve equal rights? Because as far as, there are people who are stronger, faster, smarter. Sure. There are people who are dumber, or,
Sure.
Sure. Unfortunately, people aren't equal as far as physical characteristics and capability. Now, so the question is whether or not it's about rights, right?
Well, no, because I think, as we all know, women didn't get the right to vote until 1920. And could you see someone as equal if they didn't have the same amount of rights? And for most of American history, the answer to that has been, yeah, you can be equal with me, but that doesn't mean you have the same rights. Um, I mean, kids can't vote, uh, so there's this struggle of what is the meaning of that equality. So rights doesn't automatically in our history. Rights does not automatically translate into equality. Does not automatically translate.
It's interesting that you say